The night air rested softly over the narrow streets of London. A thin layer of fog moved slowly between rows of brick houses, drifting through alleyways where the last lanterns still burned with weak yellow light. Somewhere in the distance, a horse pulled a tired cart over wet stones. The sound was slow and uneven. Hooves tapped gently against the road, then faded into the quiet darkness. Inside small homes across the city, families were settling into another night of sleep. Some children rested beneath thin blankets beside fading fires. Others slept 3 or 4 to a bed, curled close together for warmth. Outside, chimney smoke mixed with cold air, and the city slowly became still. But not every child was asleep. In the dim glow of candlelight, many Victorian children were still awake long after midnight. Some sat beside sewing tables with tired eyes that struggled to stay open. Others worked deep underground in coal mines where the darkness never truly lifted. In crowded factories, small hands continued moving through endless tasks while steam hissed from great iron machines nearby. For many children during the Victorian age, life was not designed to be easy. The world expected them to endure discomfort quietly. Hard work was seen as natural. Long hours were ordinary. Cold mornings, aching feet, rough clothing, and empty stomachs were simply part of growing up. And yet, within those difficult lives, there were also quiet moments. Warm bowls of soup after work. The sound of rain tapping softly against windows. A mother brushing dust from a child's hair at the end of the day. The comfort of resting beside brothers and sisters beneath patched blankets while the wind moved outside. Tonight, we drift slowly into that world. A world of narrow streets and smoking chimneys. A world where childhood often disappeared early. A world where young boys and girls learned very quickly how heavy life could feel. And as the city sleeps beneath its blanket of fog, we begin walking quietly through the long and tiring days of Victorian children. The morning usually began before sunrise. Long before the streets filled with carts and voices, many children were already awake. In poorer neighborhoods, small homes held entire families within only 1 or 2 rooms. The air inside could feel heavy from damp walls, smoke, and the smell of old clothing drying beside weak fires. Children often slept lightly. Babies cried during the night. Neighbors shouted through thin walls. Rats scratched quietly beneath floorboards. Cold wind slipped through cracks in windows during winter months. When morning came, there was rarely softness in the waking. A mother might gently shake a child's shoulder before dawn. Sometimes there were no words at all. The routine had become too familiar for conversation. A child opened tired eyes, rubbed cold hands together, and slowly climbed from bed while darkness still covered the streets outside. Water for washing was often freezing cold. Clothing felt rough against the skin. Many children owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, worn day after day until the fabric became thin and weak. Sleeves were patched carefully. Shoes were handed down through families until the leather split open at the sides. Breakfast depended entirely on what money the family had. For some, there was bread with a little butter or dripping from cooked meat. Others ate thin porridge made from oats. Poorer children sometimes began work with almost nothing in their stomachs except tea or dry bread. The city outside slowly came alive as children stepped into the early streets. The fog carried the smell of coal smoke everywhere. Chimneys rose above rooftops like dark towers. Horses moved heavily through muddy roads pulling carts filled with cloth, barrels, vegetables, or black coal. Bakers were already awake. Warm bread smells drifted gently from small shops into the cold morning air. Milk sellers walked through neighborhoods calling softly to customers. Street sweepers pushed dirt and animal waste aside before crowds arrived. And among the adults moved countless children. Some hurried toward factories. Some walked to workshops. Others sold matches, flowers, newspapers, or hot potatoes on busy corners. Many walked silently with heads lowered, already tired before the workday had even begun. Victorian society often believed hard work built strong character. Wealthy people sometimes spoke proudly about discipline, endurance, and duty. Children were expected to learn these lessons early. But for poor families, child labor was rarely about moral ideas. It was about survival. A father's wages alone were often not enough to pay rent, buy food, and heat a home through winter. Every member of the household needed to contribute something. Even very young children could help bring a few extra coins into the family. And so childhood became closely tied to labor. Factories were among the most common workplaces for children. Inside textile mills, the air felt warm, damp, and thick with floating fibers. Giant machines filled enormous rooms from floor to ceiling. Iron wheels turned endlessly while belts spun overhead with steady movement. The noise never truly stopped. Machines clattered and rattled hour after hour until the sound became part of the workers' thoughts. Some children later said they could still hear factory noises in their minds even while trying to sleep at night. Young workers moved carefully between dangerous machines. Small children were especially useful because of their size. They could crawl beneath equipment to clean dust and tangled fibers while the machines continued running. It was frightening work. Loose clothing or tired movements could lead to terrible injuries. But exhaustion was common. Many children worked 12 or 14 hours a day. As the long hours passed, their eyelids grew heavy beneath the hot factory air. Legs ached from standing. Fingers became sore and cracked from repeated motions. Still, the machines continued. Factory owners valued speed and constant production. Time was precious. Delays meant less profit. Children who slowed down too much could be punished harshly by supervisors. Yet within those difficult buildings, quiet human moments still appeared. Older girls sometimes helped younger children thread machines when their hands shook from tiredness. Workers shared pieces of bread during short meal breaks. Near windows, children occasionally paused for one brief second to look outside toward clouds moving slowly across the sky. For only a moment, they escaped the noise. Then work continued again. Far beneath the ground, another kind of labor waited for children in coal mines. The mines were dark, damp, and narrow. Some tunnels were so small that children spent hours bent low or crawling through tight spaces deep underground. The air smelled of earth, sweat, smoke, and coal dust. Candles or oil lamps provided weak light that flickered against black walls. Water dripped constantly from stone ceilings into muddy ground below. Many mining families lived in villages where nearly everyone worked underground. Fathers, older brothers, uncles, and children all entered the mines before sunrise together. Some young girls worked there too. Certain children opened and closed wooden ventilation doors inside the tunnels. Others pulled heavy carts of coal through narrow passages using belts strapped around their waists. The work strained growing bodies terribly. The darkness felt endless. Above ground, mornings turned into afternoons. Rain passed across distant fields. Birds crossed the sky. But underground, children often lost all sense of time. Only the weak lamplight and endless labor remained. When shifts finally ended, workers emerged slowly back into daylight covered in coal dust from head to toe. Their faces appeared pale beneath the black dirt. Eyes looked tired and distant after so many hours underground. Even simple evening air could feel strange after a full day inside the earth. Some children paused quietly outside the mines before walking home. They watched clouds moving overhead or listened to wind through grass along nearby hillsides. Those small moments of open sky mattered deeply. Not all Victorian children worked in factories or mines. Many labored inside crowded workshops where handmade goods were produced slowly by tired hands. Shoemaking workshops smelled of leather, glue, and damp wood. Tailoring rooms were filled with cloth scraps and weak candlelight. Tiny apprentices sat beside older workers learning trades through endless repetition. The work demanded patience. Children stitched seams carefully for hours at a time. Fingers grew sore from needles. Eyes strained beneath dim lighting. During winter, cold air slipped through workshop walls and settled into stiff hands. Stillness became part of the labor. In some workshops, the only sounds were scissors cutting fabric, soft coughing, and the slow crackling of nearby fires. Outside, cities continued moving with noise and smoke. But inside these rooms, time passed differently. Very slowly. In wealthier households, some children worked as servants. Large Victorian homes required constant cleaning, cooking, carrying, polishing, brushing, and washing. Young servants woke before the families they served. They lit fires, cleaned ashes, carried water upstairs, and prepared rooms for the day ahead. The work was endless because comfort itself required labor. A warm room meant coal had been carried. Clean clothing meant someone had washed and ironed it. Bright silver dishes meant long hours of polishing. Young servant girls often moved quietly through hallways trying not to be noticed. Their footsteps softened against carpets while the larger house above them remained calm and elegant. Below stairs, however, kitchens stayed busy from morning until night. Steam rose from pots. Bread baked slowly inside ovens. Laundry soaked in heavy tubs of water. Servants hurried constantly between tasks while bells rang from upstairs rooms requesting tea, food, coal, or assistance. Children serving in these homes sometimes felt invisible. Yet they observed everything quietly. They noticed the soft fabrics wealthy children wore. They saw comfortable bedrooms with thick blankets and warm fireplaces. They carried trays through peaceful rooms filled with books, clocks, and gentle candlelight. Then they returned downstairs to much smaller sleeping quarters shared with other servants. Life during the Victorian era was deeply divided by class. Some children studied music beside warm fires. Others spent their days carrying coal or stitching cloth until their backs ached. Yet even wealthy childhoods carried strict expectations. Victorian society valued obedience, discipline, and proper behavior very highly. Many upper-class children lived within carefully controlled routines. Governesses supervised lessons. Meals followed strict manners. Clothing felt formal and restrictive. Children were expected to sit correctly, speak politely, and behave calmly. Boys prepared for professional lives. Girls prepared for marriage and household management. Even playtime often carried rules and structure. Still, wealthy children experienced comforts poor children could barely imagine. Nurseries held toys, books, and soft beds. Meals were regular and filling. Illness received medical attention more quickly. The contrast between these worlds could exist only streets apart. In poorer neighborhoods, illness moved easily through crowded homes. Victorian cities struggled with sanitation problems for many years. Dirty water, overflowing waste, and polluted streets contributed to disease spreading quickly among families living close together. Children frequently became sick. Coughs echoed through narrow rooms during winter nights. Fever passed from one family member to another. Weak diets and exhausting labor left many children vulnerable to illness. Doctors existed, but medical care cost money many families simply did not have. And so mothers relied on home remedies, rest, and hope. A warm cloth placed gently on a forehead. Soup simmering quietly over a fire. Soft voices during long nights beside sick beds. Even in hardship, care and tenderness survived. Mothers often carried enormous burdens during this period. Many worked themselves while also caring for children, preparing food, washing clothing, and managing households with very little money. Their days stretched endlessly from darkness into darkness again. Hands became rough from constant labor. Backs ached from carrying water, scrubbing floors, lifting children, and standing beside cooking fires. Yet small acts of affection appeared quietly throughout ordinary days. A mother straightening a scarf before her child left for work. A tired father sharing the last piece of bread. Brothers and sisters sleeping close together beneath worn blankets while rain tapped softly outside. These moments rarely appeared in official records of history. But they filled everyday life. Outside the cities, rural children experienced different routines shaped by farming seasons and changing weather. Morning light spread slowly across fields covered in mist. Roosters called from farmyards while cows shifted quietly inside barns. The smell of damp earth and hay filled cool country air. Farm children worked early too. They gathered eggs, carried water, fed animals, and helped during planting or harvest seasons. Their labor followed nature's rhythms rather than factory whistles. Still, the work remained physically demanding. Hands became rough from tools and cold weather. Boots collected mud during rainy seasons. Long summer days stretched beneath heavy heat while children bent over fields gathering crops. But the countryside also offered moments of quiet beauty. Sunrise over distant hills. Wind moving softly through tall grass. The peaceful sound of rivers flowing beside fields at dusk. At night, country skies filled with stars unseen in smoky industrial cities. Children walked home along narrow dirt roads while lanterns glowed warmly through farmhouse windows ahead. Simple meals waited inside. Stew cooking slowly. Fresh bread cooling beside tables. Families speaking softly after long days of work. The Victorian world moved at a slower pace in these rural places, though hardship still remained close. Winter could be especially difficult for poor families everywhere. Cold entered homes easily through weak walls and broken windows. Coal cost money. Fires were kept small whenever possible. Children sometimes slept wearing layers of clothing beneath blankets that never felt fully warm. Morning frost formed along window edges. Breath appeared white inside cold rooms. Hands became numb carrying water or walking through icy streets before sunrise. Factories and workshops remained open despite the weather. Children continued working while snow or freezing rain covered roads outside. Some wrapped scarves tightly around their faces while walking through foggy winter darkness toward another long day. Others warmed stiff fingers briefly beside factory furnaces before returning to work again. Season after season, endurance became normal. And slowly, over time, people began noticing the cost. Writers, reformers, and journalists started describing the realities of child labor more openly during the 19th century. Reports emerged about dangerous conditions inside mines and factories. Some visitors were shocked by how young certain workers appeared. Public concern slowly grew. New laws eventually attempted to reduce working hours and improve safety conditions for children. Certain factories faced inspections. Mines restricted younger workers. But change moved slowly. For many families, poverty still left few choices. And so millions of children continued waking before dawn, walking through smoke-covered streets, and working long hours simply to help their families survive. As evening finally returned each day, tired workers drifted homeward beneath fading skies. Factory whistles fell silent. Workshop candles dimmed. Coal dust settled slowly onto quiet roads. Children walked with slow heavy steps through crowded neighborhoods where cooking smells now drifted from open windows. Soup simmered gently. Bread baked beside fires. Voices murmured softly inside homes glowing with weak candlelight. Some children still had chores waiting before sleep. Water needed carrying. Floors needed sweeping. Younger brothers and sisters needed care. Only later, long after darkness settled fully across the streets, did rest finally come. Bodies lowered carefully onto mattresses stuffed with straw. Blankets pulled close against cold air. The distant sounds of the city continued softly through the night. Horse carts rattling over stone roads. Wind moving through narrow alleys. Church bells ringing faintly far away. And slowly, tired eyes closed. For a few quiet hours, the labor stopped. The factories rested. The mines waited silently underground. The workshops stood dark beneath cooling night air. And Victorian children, whose lives were often shaped by difficulty from the very beginning, drifted briefly into sleep beneath the long smoky night of the 19th century. Before dawn fully arrived, the city already breathed with quiet movement. A pale grey light spread slowly above the rooftops of London, soft and cold beneath a sky hidden by smoke. Chimneys released long trails of coal smoke into the morning air, and the narrow streets below still glistened from rain that had fallen during the night. Along the edges of the roads, water gathered in shallow puddles beside stones worn smooth by years of carts and footsteps. A milk wagon creaked slowly past shuttered shops. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then became silent again. Inside crowded homes, children began waking one by one. Some slept lightly from hunger or cold and needed little encouragement to rise. Others remained wrapped tightly beneath blankets, holding on to the final moments of warmth before another difficult day began. A mother leaned over a small bed near the fire. The room smelled faintly of damp wool and yesterday's soup. Candlelight flickered against cracked plaster walls while she tied a scarf around her daughter's neck with careful hands. The girl blinked slowly, still heavy with sleep. Outside, darkness remained thick enough for street lanterns to glow faintly through the fog. The Victorian morning belonged to workers. Before shopkeepers arranged goods in windows and before wealthy families stirred upstairs beneath heavy curtains, thousands of ordinary people were already moving through the cold streets toward factories, docks, kitchens, workshops, and markets. Children moved among them quietly. Some carried lunch wrapped in cloth. Others held nothing at all. Small boots splashed through muddy roads as boys hurried toward factories where spinning machines would soon begin their endless turning. Young girls walked beside older sisters toward sewing workshops where candlelight and needlework waited for them once again. The city's rhythm pulled everyone forward. Factories often controlled time itself in Victorian industrial towns. Great bells rang out before sunrise, calling workers inside. Tall brick buildings rose above the streets with long rows of dark windows. Steam drifted from vents into the cold air while workers entered through large wooden doors one after another. Inside, warmth and noise swallowed them immediately. Machines filled entire rooms with constant movement. Belts spun overhead. Wheels turned with heavy force. The air trembled softly beneath the endless mechanical rhythm. For children working there, the body learned repetition quickly. Hands moved almost automatically after months or years of practice. Small fingers tied broken threads, cleaned machinery, folded cloth, carried tools, or gathered loose fibers from beneath dangerous gears. The work demanded constant attention. A moment of distraction could lead to injury. And yet distraction often arrived naturally through exhaustion. Some children woke long before sunrise every day for years at a time. Sleep became shallow and incomplete. By afternoon, eyelids grew heavy beneath the hot damp air of the mills. There were stories of children falling asleep while standing. Others leaned briefly against walls during pauses in production, closing their eyes for only a few seconds before supervisors noticed. The sounds inside the factories became part of their inner world. The steady clattering of machines. The hiss of steam. The sharp snapping of belts overhead. The heavy turning of iron wheels. Even after leaving work, children sometimes carried these sounds with them into the night, hearing faint echoes while lying in bed beside sleeping brothers and sisters. Outside the factories, the streets remained busy from morning until evening. Victorian cities were full of movement. Street vendors pushed small carts through crowded roads selling roasted chestnuts, bread, fish, ribbons, flowers, tea, or hot pies wrapped in paper. Chimney sweeps climbed dark rooftops. Delivery boys hurried between businesses carrying parcels through rain and smoke. Some children earned money entirely in the streets. They sold newspapers on corners where crowds gathered. Others polished shoes outside train stations or carried luggage for travelers arriving from distant towns. Small boys offered matches for sale while girls sold flowers beside busy sidewalks. Street life required constant awareness. Weather changed quickly. Customers could be kind or cruel. Police sometimes chased children away from crowded areas. During winter, cold winds moved through thin clothing while rain soaked shoes for hours at a time. But the streets also offered freedom that factories did not. Children working outdoors could at least see the sky. They watched clouds drift above rooftops. They heard church bells ringing across the city. They noticed changing seasons in ways factory workers often could not. Autumn leaves gathered beside gutters. Winter frost appeared along railings before dawn. Spring rain washed dust from the streets. Summer sunlight glowed weakly through the smoke above the city. Near the River Thames, another world of labor unfolded each day. The river carried ships, barges, smoke, noise, and endless activity through the center of London. Dock workers unloaded crates filled with tea, sugar, timber, cloth, spices, and coal brought from across the growing British Empire. Children worked there too. Some carried messages between warehouses. Others sorted ropes, cleaned equipment, or searched riverbanks for bits of coal, wood, or metal washed ashore after ships passed. The river smelled of mud, smoke, fish, wet wood, and the waste of the crowded city. Fog often rested heavily above the water during early mornings. Ship horns echoed softly through the mist while gulls circled overhead crying into the gray air. For poor families living near the docks, the river shaped daily life completely. Narrow homes leaned close together along crowded lanes. Laundry hung between windows above muddy streets. Taverns glowed warmly during cold evenings while workers gathered after long days beside the water. Children growing up there learned early how uncertain life could feel. Some days brought work. Other days brought none. And without work, there was little money for food or coal. Victorian childhood was deeply connected to uncertainty. Illness could suddenly remove a parent's income. Factories might reduce wages. Food prices could rise during difficult seasons. Families lived very close to hardship, always aware of how quickly comfort could disappear. For this reason, many children developed quiet resilience very early. They learned how to stretch meals carefully, how to mend clothing again and again, how to share beds, blankets, and shoes, how to remain patient during hunger. Simple routines became deeply important because they brought stability to difficult lives. A bowl of soup waiting after work. Tea warming cold hands beside a fire. The familiar sound of family members returning home at night. Even tiny comforts mattered greatly. In poorer districts, homes were often crowded beyond imagination. Entire families rented single rooms where sleeping, cooking, washing, and eating all happened within the same small space. Privacy barely existed. Children grew up surrounded constantly by the sounds of breathing, coughing, crying babies, footsteps overhead, and voices through thin walls. At night, the city never became completely silent. Distant carts still rattled through the streets. Drunken voices drifted from taverns. Rain tapped against windows. Wind moved softly through narrow alleys lined with brick. Some children found comfort in these familiar sounds. The noises meant home. The world outside might feel harsh and exhausting, but inside those small crowded rooms families still created warmth where they could. Mothers told quiet stories while mending clothes beside candlelight. Fathers rested tired feet near weak fires after long days of labor. Children whispered softly beneath blankets before sleep slowly overtook them. Not every moment was filled with suffering. There were ordinary evenings too. Simple laughter. Warm potatoes roasting beside coals. Songs sung quietly during household chores. Small celebrations when wages were slightly better than expected. Human life continued gently even within hardship. In schools, Victorian children encountered another kind of discipline. Education slowly became more available during the 19th century, though many poor children attended only irregularly because work remained necessary for survival. Classrooms often felt cold and strict. Rows of wooden desks faced blackboards while teachers demanded silence and obedience. Lessons relied heavily on memorization and repetition. Children copied lines carefully, recited facts aloud, and practiced handwriting with ink-stained fingers. The atmosphere could feel severe. Teachers sometimes used punishment to maintain order. Rulers struck desks sharply. Students stood in corners for mistakes. Discipline was considered essential preparation for adult life. Yet schools also opened small windows into wider worlds. Books introduced children to geography, stories, poetry, and history. Maps hung on classroom walls showing distant oceans and countries many students would never see. For some children, reading became a quiet refuge. Libraries were rare luxuries for poor families, but borrowed books occasionally passed from hand to hand through neighborhoods. Children read beside fires late into the evening when exhaustion allowed. Stories offered temporary escape from smoke-filled streets and endless labor. Even a few peaceful pages could feel precious. Meanwhile, in wealthier parts of society, childhood unfolded within very different surroundings. Large homes stood along cleaner streets lined with gas lamps and carefully maintained sidewalks. Curtains glowed warmly in tall windows during evening hours. Servants prepared meals downstairs while children studied piano, languages, drawing, or etiquette in comfortable rooms above. Still, even privileged children experienced lives shaped heavily by expectation. Victorian society valued control and restraint across every class. Young boys at boarding schools often lived under strict discipline far from their families. Days followed careful schedules filled with lessons, prayers, exercise, and formal meals. Loneliness could settle quietly into those large stone school buildings. Letters from home became treasured possessions. At night, candlelight flickered softly across dormitories while boys whispered quietly beneath blankets after teachers finished their rounds. Girls from wealthy families faced different expectations. They learned music, sewing, manners, conversation, and household management. Many were carefully prepared for adult social roles rather than independence. Corsets tightened around growing bodies. Long dresses restricted movement. Formal behavior remained important almost constantly. Even comfort itself often carried rules. Across Victorian society, appearances mattered deeply. Cleanliness, order, politeness, and respectability were treated as signs of moral character. Families worked hard to maintain dignity even when living in poverty. Children understood this early. Clothing was brushed carefully before leaving home. Hair was combed despite limited time. Boots were cleaned as well as possible before school or work. Small gestures of respectability helped families feel pride despite hardship. And pride mattered greatly in a difficult world. During evenings, gas lamps slowly illuminated city streets one by one. Their soft yellow glow reflected across wet stones while fog thickened again between buildings. Shops closed their shutters. Factory windows darkened. Workers poured slowly from gates and alleyways into the cooling air. The pace of movement changed. Morning urgency disappeared. Now exhaustion guided each step homeward. Children returned carrying the weight of long days inside small aching bodies. Hands smelled of machine oil, coal dust, soap, fish, leather, smoke, or damp cloth depending on where they had labored since sunrise. Some still needed to fetch water or run errands before rest could begin. Others helped prepare evening meals in crowded kitchens glowing with weak firelight. Food remained simple for most working families. Bread, potatoes, soup, onions, oats, cabbage, and tea appeared often at ordinary tables. Meat was less common for the poor, though even small portions felt deeply comforting after long labor. Meals were filling when possible. Warmth mattered as much as taste. Steam rose gently from bowls while tired families sat close together in rooms dimly lit by candles or fires. Outside, the city softened beneath the growing darkness. Rain sometimes drifted quietly against windows. Wind carried chimney smoke across rooftops. Church bells echoed faintly through the evening fog. And slowly, another Victorian night settled over the streets. In hospitals and workhouses, many children experienced even harsher realities. Workhouses housed the poorest members of society, including orphaned children and struggling families with nowhere else to go. These institutions were designed around strict discipline and minimal comfort. Officials believed difficult conditions would discourage dependency. Rooms felt plain and cold. Meals were basic and repetitive. Rules controlled daily life closely. Children separated from parents inside workhouses often experienced deep loneliness. Long dormitories held rows of narrow beds beneath bare walls. Footsteps echoed through quiet halls while weak light entered through high windows. The atmosphere felt heavy with routine. Wake. Work. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. Yet even there, children formed friendships quietly. They whispered together at night. Shared bits of food. Comforted one another during illness or fear. Human connection survived stubbornly even within harsh systems. Victorian hospitals also reflected the limits of medicine during the time. Illnesses that seem treatable today could become deeply dangerous. Infections spread easily. Crowded wards smelled of soap, sickness, and candle smoke. Children often feared hospitals greatly. Families usually preferred caring for sick relatives at home whenever possible. And so many mothers spent long nights beside bedsides listening carefully to each breath of a feverish child while rain tapped softly outside the window. Winter illnesses were especially feared. Cold damp air worsened coughs and lung diseases. Poor heating left many homes freezing during long nights. Thin blankets provided little protection against deep cold settling into stone walls and narrow streets. Still, life continued steadily through every season. Spring brought muddy roads and pale sunlight after long gray winters. Summer filled the city with heat, dust, and stronger smells rising from crowded streets. Autumn covered gutters with wet leaves beneath foggy skies. And always the work continued. Children grew older quietly within these routines. A small factory worker became a teenage laborer. A young servant learned every corner of a great house. A boy carrying coal at 12 might still carry it at 20. For many, adulthood arrived gradually without clear separation from childhood at all. Responsibility simply increased year by year. And through it all, the Victorian world kept moving beneath smoke-filled skies and flickering gaslight, while countless children endured lives shaped not by ease, but by patience, labor, exhaustion, and the quiet determination to continue another day. The fog returned again with the evening tide. It drifted slowly through the narrow streets of London like a soft grey blanket, wrapping itself around gas lamps, rooftops, and quiet alleyways where rainwater still glimmered between the stones. Far above the city, the moon remained hidden behind layers of smoke rising endlessly from factory chimneys. The air smelled of coal fires and damp brick. Somewhere in the distance, a train moved slowly across iron tracks, its low rumble fading gently into the night. Inside small homes scattered across the city, children were already asleep after long days of labor. Others were only now returning home, walking with tired steps through streets that glowed faintly beneath rows of lanterns. Victorian cities rarely became fully silent. Even late at night, there were still horses pulling carts through dark roads. Dock workers unloaded ships beside the river under weak torchlight. Bakers prepared bread for the coming morning while chimney smoke drifted quietly upward into the cold air. And among all this movement lived children whose days often felt much older than their years. Many Victorian children learned early how to carry exhaustion quietly. Complaining rarely changed anything. The routines of work continued whether bodies felt strong or weak, whether weather brought icy rain or heavy summer heat. Children woke when they were told to wake. They worked until the day finally ended. Then they slept briefly before beginning again. Over time, tiredness became normal. Some children no longer noticed aching feet or sore hands because such discomfort had existed for as long as they could remember. For girls working in textile mills, the body adjusted slowly to the endless standing. Legs throbbed during the first months of labor. Fingers blistered from rough cloth and machinery. But eventually, many learned how to move automatically through the long hours while their minds drifted elsewhere. Sometimes they thought about warm food waiting at home. Sometimes they remembered green fields from distant villages their families had left behind years earlier. Sometimes they simply watched light moving slowly across factory windows as morning turned quietly into afternoon. The factories themselves felt almost alive. Steam curled upward from iron pipes like breath. Great machines shook the wooden floors beneath workers' feet. Windows gathered layers of dust that softened the sunlight entering from outside. In winter, the warmth inside could feel strangely comforting at first after cold walks through icy streets. But after many hours, the heat became heavy and exhausting. The air thickened with lint and smoke. Breathing felt difficult. Children wiped sweat from their foreheads while the machines continued spinning endlessly around them. Meal breaks arrived briefly, then disappeared again. A small piece of bread, Cold potatoes wrapped in cloth. Weak tea carried carefully in metal containers. Simple meals eaten quickly beside loud machinery before the work resumed once more. Some children sat quietly during breaks, too tired even for conversation. Others whispered softly with friends while stretching sore backs and stiff fingers. These friendships mattered deeply. Within difficult workplaces, companionship became one of the few gentle comforts available. Children helped each other learn tasks, shared bits of food, or exchanged quiet stories during rare moments of rest. Human warmth survived in small ways. A hand placed kindly on a shoulder. A whispered warning near dangerous machinery. A smile exchanged across a crowded room. Even tiny acts of kindness could ease the heaviness of long labor. In the countryside, life moved according to very different sounds. Instead of machinery, mornings began with birdsong drifting across damp fields. Wind moved gently through tall grass while cows shifted lazily near wooden fences. The earth smelled rich after rain, and sunlight spread slowly across hills covered in mist. Yet rural childhood carried its own hardships. Farm labor depended entirely on the seasons. During harvest months, children worked long hours gathering crops beneath heavy skies. Small hands picked vegetables from cold soil or carried bundles of grain across uneven ground. Boots filled with mud after rainstorms. Fingers became rough from tools and rope. Summer heat could feel endless in open fields. Children bent over rows of crops while sweat gathered beneath collars and straw hats. Dust clung to skin and clothing during dry weather. By afternoon, exhaustion settled deeply into growing bodies beneath the unbroken sun. Still, the countryside offered moments of stillness rarely found inside industrial cities. At dusk, the land softened into quiet shadows. Lanterns glowed warmly through farmhouse windows. Crickets sang beside narrow dirt roads. Children walked slowly home past fields where evening mist gathered low across the grass. Inside farmhouses, suppers waited on wooden tables. Stew simmered gently over fires. Fresh bread cooled beneath cloths. Simple conversations drifted softly through warm kitchens while rain tapped quietly against windows. For many rural children, family life remained closely connected to work itself. Parents and children labored together through changing seasons. Skills passed naturally between generations through observation and repetition. A father teaching a son how to guide a plow. A mother showing a daughter how to knead bread dough beside the fire. These quiet lessons shaped ordinary life more deeply than formal schooling ever could. In fishing villages along the coast, children grew up beside another kind of labor. The sea controlled nearly everything there. Before dawn, fishing boats pushed slowly away from shore beneath pale skies while gulls circled overhead crying into the wind. The smell of salt water mixed with wet rope, fish, seaweed, and wood soaked by countless tides. Children helped clean nets, sort catches, carry baskets, or prepare equipment for the next day's work. The ocean could appear peaceful one morning and dangerous by evening. Families understood this uncertainty well. Wives watched the horizon during storms. Children listened quietly to strong winds rattling windows through the night. And yet life continued steadily beside the water, shaped by tides, weather, patience, and endurance. Victorian childhood was deeply tied to labor because survival itself depended on labor. But even within these difficult routines, children still found moments for play whenever time allowed. In crowded city streets, boys kicked worn balls through alleyways between buildings. Girls skipped rope beside rows of laundry hanging overhead. Chalk games appeared briefly on sidewalks before rain washed them away again. Play happened quickly. A few minutes between chores. A short hour before darkness. Children laughed while they could, then returned to work, errands, or family responsibilities. Simple toys carried enormous value. A carved wooden figure. A rag doll stitched carefully by hand. A smooth stone kept in a pocket. Many poor families could not afford store-bought toys, so children created entertainment from whatever materials existed nearby. Imagination softened hardship where it could. During holidays, even struggling families tried to create small moments of celebration. Christmas brought candles glowing warmly against dark winter evenings. Some homes displayed tiny decorations made from paper or greenery gathered outside. Children hung stockings hopefully beside weak fires while snow drifted quietly through the streets beyond the windows. Gifts were often simple. An orange. A scarf. A small handmade toy. But the atmosphere itself mattered more than luxury. For one evening, ordinary routines softened slightly. Songs were sung. Soup smelled richer than usual. Families gathered close against the cold. These gentle pauses helped people endure difficult lives year after year. Religion also shaped daily existence for many Victorian families. Church bells marked time across cities and villages alike. Sundays often brought cleaner clothing, quieter streets, and moments of rest from ordinary labor. Families walked together through foggy mornings toward churches warmed by candlelight and crowded with wooden pews. Inside, voices rose softly in prayer and hymns. Children listened to sermons about duty, morality, patience, and humility while rain tapped quietly against stained glass windows overhead. For some, religion offered comfort. For others, simply a familiar rhythm within difficult lives. Either way, the routines of faith became woven deeply into Victorian society. As children grew older, many faced the quiet fear of adulthood arriving too quickly. A boy might already work full-time by the age of 12 or 13. A girl could enter domestic service while still very young, leaving home to live among strangers in large unfamiliar houses. Childhood often faded gradually rather than ending clearly. Responsibility increased year by year until innocence simply disappeared beneath routine labor. Some young people dreamed quietly of improving their lives someday. A better position. Higher wages. A small shop of their own. A warmer home. But opportunities remained limited for many working families. The class system during the Victorian age felt heavy and deeply rooted. Wealth and poverty often passed from one generation to the next like an inheritance difficult to escape. Still, hope survived stubbornly. Parents saved coins slowly whenever possible. Children attended evening schools after work hoping literacy might open new doors. Families encouraged one another through hardships with quiet determination. And sometimes change did arrive, though slowly. As the 19th century continued, public concern about child labor grew stronger. Writers described dangerous factories and crowded slums in newspapers and books. Reformers visited mines and workshops, recording the exhausting conditions children endured each day. People began asking difficult questions. Should children work such long hours? Should young bodies spend entire days underground? Should factories continue employing children so small they could crawl beneath machines? New laws slowly emerged. Working hours for children were reduced in some industries. Factory inspections became more common. Education gradually expanded. But progress moved unevenly. Many families still relied heavily on children's wages to survive, especially during economic hardship. And so, despite reforms, countless boys and girls continued laboring through long exhausting days beneath smoky skies. In hospitals and orphanages, life followed strict routines shaped by bells and schedules. Children lined up for meals inside echoing halls. Shoes tapped softly against stone floors. Windows rattled during winter storms while weak fires struggled to warm large rooms. Some children there had lost parents to illness, accidents, or poverty. Others had simply been abandoned when families could no longer feed another mouth. Loneliness settled quietly into these places. Yet children still formed friendships wherever they could. Whispered conversations after lights out. Shared pieces of bread hidden from supper. Secret smiles during long quiet days. Even in institutions designed around discipline, human tenderness found small spaces to survive. Meanwhile, in the homes of wealthy families, children lived surrounded by comfort that seemed almost unimaginable elsewhere. Soft carpets muffled footsteps. Curtains blocked winter drafts. Fires burned steadily in multiple rooms. Nurses and servants cared for daily needs while governesses supervised education. Still, emotional distance often existed within these privileged households too. Victorian ideals sometimes encouraged restraint even within families. Children were expected to behave properly rather than express emotions freely. Formal manners shaped interactions between parents and children, especially in upper-class homes. Affection could feel quiet and controlled. A gentle nod. A careful hand resting briefly on a shoulder. A softly spoken word of approval. Across every class, Victorian childhood carried expectations of discipline, endurance, and obedience. The world believed difficulty built character. And so children learned to endure discomfort early. Cold mornings. Long labor. Strict rules. Heavy clothing. Hard beds. Hungry evenings. Aching muscles. Yet despite everything, life still contained beauty. Fog glowing beneath gas lamps. Warm bread fresh from ovens. Snow falling silently across rooftops. Summer sunlight through dusty windows. The sound of distant church bells drifting through evening air. A mother humming softly while sewing beside the fire. A child falling asleep safely at last after a long exhausting day. These quiet moments mattered because they offered rest within difficult lives. And now, as another Victorian night settles gently across the sleeping city, the streets grow quieter once again. Factory windows darken. Coal fires burn low. Rain taps softly against rooftops while tired families drift slowly into sleep beneath blankets patched and worn by many winters. The great city exhales smoke into the cold night sky. And somewhere, in a narrow room lit faintly by candlelight, a child closes heavy eyes at the end of another long day in a world that expected endurance from even its smallest hands. Morning arrived slowly over the rooftops of the industrial city. The first light did not come brightly here. It filtered weakly through smoke drifting above chimneys and factory towers, turning the sky a pale gray instead of blue. Rain from the night before still rested along the streets in narrow shining lines beside the stones. A cold wind moved quietly between rows of brick houses. Inside small rooms crowded with sleeping families, children stirred beneath rough blankets while the darkness outside softened little by little toward dawn. Some woke naturally from habit. Others listened for familiar sounds that marked the beginning of another day. A kettle being placed above the fire. Boots moving across wooden floors. A parent coughing softly in the cold morning air. The creaking of a door opening toward the street outside. Victorian mornings often began before the body was ready. Children sat slowly at tables rubbing tired eyes while weak tea steamed gently from cups chipped by years of use. Bread was sliced carefully so every piece lasted as long as possible. Some families spread jam thinly to make it stretch across several meals. In poorer homes, silence often filled the early hour. People were still waking fully. The long day ahead already felt heavy. Outside, the city gradually came alive beneath layers of smoke and fog. Street lamps flickered faintly before disappearing in the growing daylight. Shopkeepers lifted shutters from windows. Horses snorted clouds of white breath into the cold air while carts rattled toward markets and factories. And through all of it moved children. Small figures in worn coats and patched shoes walked steadily through narrow streets toward another day of labor. Many carried their exhaustion quietly. A young girl held a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth beneath her arm while hurrying toward the textile mill before the morning bell rang. Two boys walked together toward the docks with collars turned up against the wind. Another child swept ash from a doorstep while yawning into the gray morning air. The city belonged to workers long before sunrise. Inside factories, gas lamps still burned because daylight alone could not fully reach the enormous rooms filled with machinery. Steam drifted upward through iron beams while workers took their places beside spinning wheels and clattering looms. The noise began gradually. A wheel turning. A belt tightening overhead. Then suddenly the entire building seemed to awaken at once. Iron machines shook the wooden floors. Steam hissed sharply through pipes. Threads snapped and were tied again. Supervisors moved through crowded rows watching the pace of production carefully. Children slipped into these rhythms immediately. Hands moved from memory more than thought. They tied threads. Cleaned beneath machines. Carried bundles of cloth. Reached carefully into narrow spaces where adults could not fit. Hour after hour, movement repeated itself endlessly. The body learned how to continue even while tired. Many children became skilled at resting parts of the mind while the hands kept working automatically. Thoughts drifted gently through memories, worries, or small daydreams while machinery roared around them. Some imagined quiet countryside villages they barely remembered from early childhood. Others thought about food waiting at home later that night. A few simply counted the hours until evening. Near the factory windows, dust floated softly through narrow beams of light whenever the sun briefly appeared behind the smoke outside. Those windows offered small reminders that another world existed beyond the walls. Birds crossing the sky. Rain sliding down glass. Clouds moving slowly overhead. Simple things that factory workers rarely had time to notice fully. In textile mills, young girls often worked side by side for years. Friendships formed quietly between shared exhaustion and long routine. They whispered softly during breaks, helped repair torn clothing, or saved places near warmer corners during winter mornings. Sometimes they sang very quietly while working. Not loudly enough to disturb supervisors. Only enough to soften the endless mechanical sounds surrounding them. Songs helped time pass more gently. The melodies drifted through the factory air like distant memories of calmer places. In workshops across the city, another rhythm unfolded. Tailors bent over tables beneath weak light stitching coats and dresses late into the evening. Shoemakers worked among the smells of leather, glue, and damp wool. Apprentices swept floors, sorted tools, carried water, and slowly learned trades through repetition. The work demanded patience more than speed. Tiny stitches. Careful cuts. Steady hands beneath dim candlelight. Children working in these places often developed sore backs from leaning over tables all day long. Eyes strained against poor lighting. Fingers toughened slowly from needles, scissors, and rough materials. But workshops sometimes felt quieter than factories. The noise there was human rather than mechanical. Soft conversation. The scraping of chairs. Scissors sliding through cloth. Rain tapping gently against windows. In winter, Workers gathered close beside stoves whenever possible, stretching cold hands toward weak warmth before returning to their tasks again. Meanwhile, on the streets outside, weather shaped daily life constantly. Victorian cities could feel bitterly cold during winter months. Fog mixed with smoke until entire neighborhoods disappeared into gray mist. Wet wind slipped through coats and scarves no matter how tightly they were wrapped. Boots became soaked walking through muddy roads lined with slush and horse tracks. Children selling newspapers or matches outdoors endured the cold hour after hour. They stamped their feet against frozen sidewalks trying to keep warm. Breath rose white before their faces. Hands became stiff and red from icy air. Yet they continued calling softly to passing strangers in hopes of earning enough coins to bring home. Summer brought different hardships. Heat settled heavily over crowded streets where fresh air moved poorly between narrow buildings. The smell of smoke, animals, garbage, and river water grew stronger beneath the sun. Factories became stifling. Workshops felt suffocating. Children wiped sweat from their faces while dust clung to damp skin and clothing. Open windows offered little relief when the city air itself felt thick and heavy. Still, evening eventually arrived. An evening always carried a certain softness after the labor of the day. The pace of the streets changed slowly as workers began returning home. Factory whistles echoed across the rooftops while crowds poured through gates and alleyways into the cooling air. Children walked beside adults through gathering darkness. Some spoke quietly together. Others remained silent from exhaustion. Gas lamps flickered awake one by one along the roads, their yellow light glowing gently through the evening fog. Shops displayed warm pools of light behind windows filled with bread, candles, fabric, books, and polished shoes. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts beside small fires while steam drifted upward into the night air. For hungry workers, the smell of food could feel almost overwhelming after long hours without rest. At home, simple meals waited where families could afford them. Soup simmering slowly. Potatoes roasting beside coals. Stew thick with onions and carrots. Even plain bread tasted comforting after exhausting labor. Children sat at crowded tables listening to the familiar sounds of home around them. Bowls touching wood. Quiet conversation. A baby crying softly nearby. Rain against windows. A kettle beginning to whistle gently over the fire. These ordinary sounds became deeply connected with safety and rest. Not every family had enough food each night. Periods of unemployment or illness could leave homes frighteningly empty. Some parents skipped meals so children could eat slightly more. Others borrowed small amounts from neighbors or local shops whenever possible. Poverty often created constant quiet worry inside households. Rent payments. Coal for heat. Shoes needing repair. Medical costs after accidents or illness. The weight of survival rested heavily on working families every single day. Children understood these worries earlier than children often do now. They noticed parents whispering late at night. They saw the careful counting of coins near candlelight. They recognized tension in the silence before difficult conversations. And so many children tried hard not to create additional burdens. They worked quietly, shared what they had, accepted discomfort without complaint. This quiet endurance shaped much of Victorian childhood. Illness remained one of the greatest fears. A simple cough could grow worse quickly inside cold, crowded homes. Diseases spread easily through narrow streets where sanitation remained poor. During outbreaks, entire neighborhoods carried an atmosphere of unease and exhaustion. Doctors visited wealthier homes more often than poorer ones. For working families, home remedies remained common. Warm broth, Rest near the fire. Herbal mixtures prepared carefully by mothers and grandmothers. Children recovering from sickness often lay listening to the ordinary sounds of the household around them while weak winter sunlight entered through curtains. The crackling of firewood. Soft footsteps across the room. The distant bells of churches outside. Recovery felt slow and uncertain. And sometimes recovery never came at all. Victorian families were sadly familiar with loss. Many children experienced the death of siblings, parents, or friends at young ages. Mourning clothes appeared frequently in neighborhoods where illness and difficult working conditions shortened lives. Yet grief itself often remained quiet. Life still demanded continuation. Factories opened the next morning. Coal still needed carrying. Bread still needed earning. So people carried sorrow gently alongside routine labor and daily survival. In wealthier homes, childhood looked softer from the outside. Nurseries held polished toys and warm blankets. Piano music drifted through hallways while governesses supervised lessons in comfortable rooms filled with books and maps. But even there, Victorian children lived within strict expectations. Schedules organized the day carefully. Proper manners were constantly reinforced. Emotions were expected to remain controlled and polite. Children practiced posture, handwriting, language, and social etiquette for hours at a time. Young girls embroidered beside windows while sunlight rested across fine carpets. Boys prepared for boarding schools and professional careers through disciplined study. Comfort existed, but freedom often remained limited. Across every class, Victorian society valued self-control deeply. And so children everywhere learned how to behave according to the expectations surrounding them. Yet beneath all the structure and hardship, ordinary human feelings remained unchanged. Children still became frightened during storms. Still laughed during games. Still longed for warmth, affection, rest, and comfort. A child falling asleep beside a parent after a fever. A brother sharing half a potato with his sister. A girl pausing beside a factory window to watch snow falling quietly outside. These small moments reveal the softer side of Victorian life often hidden beneath the harder realities. Late at night, after the city finally quieted, London could feel strangely peaceful. Fog rested low across empty streets while gas lamps glowed like distant stars through the mist. Most factory fires burned lower now. Windows darkened one by one across the crowded neighborhoods. Only a few sounds remained. Horse hooves somewhere far away. The faint whistle of wind between buildings. A train rumbling softly through the darkness. Inside tiny rooms, children slept deeply from exhaustion. Some curled beside siblings beneath patched blankets. Others rested in servant quarters below great silent houses. A few remained awake longer than the rest, staring quietly toward candlelight while listening to the breathing of family members nearby. Tomorrow would come early again. Another morning. Another long walk through smoky streets. Another day of labor beneath the gray Victorian sky. But for now, during these quiet midnight hours, the city softened gently into silence, and tired children drifted at last into precious sleep while rain whispered softly against the rooftops above them. In the deepest hours before dawn, the city felt almost gentle. Fog rested quietly over the rooftops, softening the sharp edges of chimneys and factory towers until everything seemed distant and dreamlike. Gas lamps flickered faintly along empty streets where rainwater reflected pale yellow light across the stones. The noise of the day had finally faded. No factory whistles echoed now. No market carts rattled through crowded roads. Only the occasional sound of horse hooves drifted softly through the darkness before disappearing once more into silence. Inside the narrow homes of working families, children slept heavily from exhaustion. Small hands rested against worn blankets. Boots stood drying beside weak fires that had nearly burned out. The air inside many homes smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, and soup cooked earlier that evening. Some children dreamed peacefully. Others slept so deeply that dreams never came at all. Their bodies simply rested wherever they could. For many Victorian children, sleep was less about comfort and more about recovery. Long hours of labor demanded enormous energy from growing bodies. Even the youngest workers often collapsed into bed at night with aching legs, stiff backs, and tired hands still carrying traces of coal dust, thread fibers, soap, or mud beneath their fingernails. Yet despite the hardship, there was a strange quiet beauty in these nighttime hours. Families gathered close together beneath the same roof. The cold remained outside for a while. And for a few brief hours, no one demanded work from them. As the night slowly passed, bakers became some of the first workers awake again. Before sunrise touched the rooftops, ovens already glowed warmly inside small bakeries tucked between rows of brick buildings. The smell of fresh bread drifted gently into the dark streets while dough was kneaded, shaped, and placed carefully into iron ovens. Some bakery apprentices were children themselves. They worked through the night beside older bakers in rooms thick with warmth and flour dust. Their eyes often looked heavy with sleep while they carried trays, swept floors, or shaped loaves beneath candlelight. Outside, milk carts began moving quietly through the streets. The city was preparing to wake once more. And little by little, windows across the neighborhoods showed signs of life returning. A candle appearing behind curtains. A door opening briefly into the cold air. The soft sound of someone coughing in the distance. Morning routines returned with familiar certainty. In poor districts, breakfast remained simple and practical. Bread, porridge, weak tea, or leftover potatoes filled empty stomachs as best they could. Families ate quickly because work could not wait. Children dressed in clothing still damp from the previous day's rain. Boots were pulled on again even if the soles had begun separating from the leather. Scarves wrapped tightly around thin necks. Then they stepped outside into the grey morning streets once more. Many Victorian cities smelled strongly of coal at dawn. Smoke hung low between buildings while factory chimneys released dark clouds into the pale sky above. The damp air carried the scent of horses, river water, wet stone, and burning fuel. Children walked through all of it quietly. Some hurried because arriving late could mean punishment or lost wages. Others moved slowly from exhaustion, already settling back into their bodies before the workday had even begun. In factories, the morning bell marked the return of endless routine. Large rooms filled gradually with workers taking their places beside machinery. Gas lamps still burned overhead while weak daylight struggled through dirty windows. The machines began slowly at first. Then faster. And soon the familiar thunder of industry swallowed every other sound again. Victorian factories demanded not only labor, but attention. Children had to remain alert despite exhaustion because machinery could be dangerous in countless ways. Loose sleeves, tired movements, or small mistakes sometimes led to terrible injuries. And yet accidents remained common. A hand caught between gears. Hair tangled in moving belts. A child stumbling from fatigue near heavy equipment. Factories could feel unforgiving because the machines themselves never slowed for human weakness. Still, work continued every day. The industrial world depended on constant motion. Cotton had to be spun. Cloth had to be woven. Coal had to be carried. Goods had to be packed and shipped across the growing empire. and behind much of that labor stood children whose small bodies kept enormous systems moving quietly beneath the smoke-filled skies. Some factory owners eventually introduced shorter hours or slightly safer conditions after growing public criticism. But improvements arrived slowly, unevenly, and often only after years of suffering. For many children, daily life changed very little at first. The bells still rang before sunrise. The shifts still stretched endlessly. The exhaustion still followed them home each evening. Meanwhile, in homes across the countryside, children were beginning very different mornings. The land woke softly there. Mist rested across open fields while birds called from hedges and rooftops. Farmhouses stood quiet beneath pale skies slowly brightening with dawn. Smoke rose gently from chimneys where fires were being lit for breakfast. The air smelled of damp soil, hay, wood smoke, and cold grass touched by morning dew. Rural children often worked outdoors from a very young age. Tasks changed with the seasons. In spring, fields needed planting. In summer, crops demanded tending beneath long hot days. Autumn brought harvest labor from sunrise until dusk. Winter required feeding animals, carrying firewood, and repairing tools for the colder months ahead. The work could feel endless, but nature offered moments of calm throughout the day. A breeze moving softly through wheat fields. The distant sound of sheep bells along green hills. Sunlight warming tired shoulders during cool mornings. At night, the countryside became deeply quiet in ways cities never could. No factories roared there. No endless wheels turned through the darkness. Only crickets, wind, and distant owls filled the evening air. Children sleeping in rural homes often rested more peacefully, though their labor remained physically demanding all the same. Across Britain, the Victorian age reshaped landscapes completely. Railways spread across the countryside carrying coal, goods, workers, and travelers between rapidly growing cities. Iron tracks crossed fields and valleys where only dirt roads had existed before. For many children, trains felt both exciting and unsettling. The engines were enormous. Steam poured upward into the sky. The sound of wheels against tracks echoed through villages long after the trains had passed. Railway stations became busy gathering places filled with luggage, smoke, shouting porters, and passengers wrapped in heavy coats. Some boys found work there carrying bags or cleaning platforms. Others simply stood nearby watching trains disappear toward distant cities they would never visit themselves. The Victorian world seemed to move faster with each passing decade. Factories grew larger. Cities expanded outward. More smoke rose into the skies every year. Yet ordinary life for poor children often remained centered around the same basic needs. Food, warmth, work, rest. Survival itself required enormous effort. For girls, domestic responsibilities often began early even outside formal employment. Many spent hours helping mothers wash clothing in heavy tubs filled with cold water. Laundry days were exhausting. Wet fabric became surprisingly heavy to lift, scrub, rinse, and hang. Hands turned red from soap and winter air. Backs ached from bending over steaming water. Children also fetched water from pumps, cleaned floors, cared for younger siblings, peeled vegetables, mended torn clothing, and helped prepare meals. The labor of maintaining a household was constant and physically demanding. Yet it rarely appeared in official records as work in the same way factory labor did. Still, these quiet domestic routines shaped childhood deeply. A girl standing beside a stove stirring soup while rain tapped softly outside. A boy carrying coal upstairs in the fading evening light. Brothers and sisters sharing blankets while their mother sewed late into the night beside candlelight. These ordinary scenes filled Victorian life far more often than grand historical events ever did. In wealthier homes, servants performed much of this labor instead. Young maids climbed endless staircases carrying water and linens through large silent houses. Kitchen workers prepared complicated meals downstairs where heat from ovens filled the air from morning until night. Child servants often lived entirely within the households where they worked. Some rarely visited their own families. Loneliness followed them quietly through polished hallways and servant quarters hidden below stairs. Yet they too created small routines of comfort. Sharing tea together late at night after the household had gone to sleep. Laughing softly during kitchen work. Saving scraps of cake or bread from large dinners upstairs. Even within difficult systems, people searched naturally for warmth and companionship. As evening returned once more to the Victorian city, gas lamps flickered awake through gathering fog. The streets changed character again. Workers moved homeward beneath darkening skies while shop windows glowed warmly against the cold. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through crowded sidewalks. Horses pulled tired carts through mud shining beneath the lantern light. Children walked slowly now. The energy of morning had faded completely. Small shoulders slumped beneath coats dusted with lint, soot, or rain. Some still carried unfinished errands. Others simply focused on reaching home and rest. Inside tiny kitchens and narrow rooms, fires crackled softly while suppers cooked. Steam rose from simple meals. Candles flickered gently against worn walls. Families gathered close together once more after another difficult day. And though the Victorian world often demanded hardness from its children, these evening moments still held traces of tenderness. A father lifting a sleeping child from a chair to bed. A mother brushing hair carefully away from tired eyes. Quiet voices speaking softly while the rain whispered outside the windows. Then slowly, one by one, candles dimmed across the city. Factories fell silent again. The docks quieted beside the dark river. Fog settled low through empty streets beneath the cold night sky. And countless Victorian children, worn down by labor, routine, and long years of endurance, drifted gently back into sleep while the great industrial city breathed softly around them in the darkness. The river moved quietly through the sleeping city. Beneath the pale glow of the moon hidden behind drifting smoke, the Thames carried dark water slowly past bridges, docks, and warehouses standing silent in the night. Small ripples touched wooden posts along the shore while fog gathered low above the surface like a soft grey blanket. Most of London had fallen asleep now. Factory windows stood dark. Shop doors were locked. The endless movement of the day had finally slowed into stillness. But even during the quietest hours, there were always a few children still awake somewhere in the Victorian city. A young servant girl finished polishing silver beside a fading kitchen fire deep below a wealthy house. A newspaper boy slept lightly beneath an archway after failing to earn enough for lodging. In a narrow room above a crowded alley, a mother sat beside her feverish child listening carefully to each breath while candlelight trembled softly against the walls. The city never fully rested. And neither did many of its children. As dawn approached again, cold air crept through gaps in windows and beneath doors. Fires burned low. Blankets shifted softly as tired bodies searched for warmth during the final hours before morning. Then slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the cycle began once more. A distant cart rolling through the streets. Footsteps on wet stones. The creak of shutters opening toward the gray sky. Victorian life moved in endless repetition. For working children, one day often looked very much like the next. The same streets. The same labor. The same exhaustion settling heavily into growing bones. and yet small changes still marked the passing of time. Children grew taller. Voices deepened slowly. Seasons turned from cold to warmth and back again. Friendships formed and disappeared. Families moved between neighborhoods searching for cheaper rent or better work. The city itself changed constantly around them. New factories rose above older streets. Railway lines spread farther through crowded districts. Smoke thickened year by year above the rooftops. London during the Victorian age became one of the largest cities on earth, filled with enormous wealth and deep poverty existing side by side. Children saw these differences clearly. A poor child delivering packages to wealthy homes might step briefly into bright hallways warmed by several fireplaces at once. Thick carpets softened footsteps there. Mirrors reflected gaslight across polished walls. Tables overflowed with food during evening dinners. Then the child returned outside into cold fog and narrow streets where entire families shared a single dim room. The contrast lingered quietly in the mind. Some children accepted these differences as natural because they had never known another world. Others wondered silently what life might feel like without constant labor and worry. But dreams often remained private things. Victorian society placed great value on duty and endurance. Many children learned early not to speak openly about unhappiness. They simply continued forward through routine because there seemed little alternative. For boys working in mines, the body adapted slowly to underground life. Before sunrise, groups of workers walked together toward the pithheads beneath dark skies streaked with weak morning light. The ground near the mines often looked blackened from coal dust covering roads, fences, and buildings nearby. Everything smelled faintly of smoke and earth. The descent underground could feel frightening at first for young children entering the mines for the first time. Cages lowered workers deep beneath the surface where sunlight disappeared completely. The air changed there. Cooler. Damp. Heavy with the smell of stone and coal dust. Candles or oil lamps cast weak trembling light against rough tunnel walls while workers disappeared deeper into narrow passages beneath the earth. Some tunnels forced children to crawl long distances bent low against the rock overhead. Others were filled with water or thick mud that soaked clothing and boots hour after hour. Silence underground felt different from silence above ground. It carried weight. Only distant scraping, dripping water, and the rumble of carts moving through darkness broke the stillness. Many children feared cave-ins, explosions, or sudden accidents. Yet over time even fear became part of ordinary routine. The human mind can become accustomed to remarkable hardship when hardship surrounds daily life from the very beginning. When shifts ended, workers emerged slowly back into daylight blinking against the brightness of the open sky. Fresh air felt startling after hours underground. Some boys paused outside the mine simply to breathe deeply before beginning the walk home. Clouds moving overhead. Wind across open hills. Birds calling somewhere in the distance. Simple things felt strangely precious after darkness. Back in the cities, factory children experienced a different kind of confinement. They remained above ground, but their days still unfolded within crowded indoor spaces filled with noise, heat, and repetitive motion. Some workers barely saw daylight during winter months because they entered factories before sunrise and left after dusk. Gaslight became more familiar than sunlight itself. Inside spinning mills, cotton fibers floated constantly through the air like pale dust. Workers inhaled these particles day after day, often developing coughs and breathing difficulties over time. The body paid quietly for industrial progress. Still, many children showed remarkable resilience. They found ways to laugh between tasks. Ways to sing softly during long hours. Ways to protect younger workers from cruel supervisors whenever possible. Not every factory owner behaved harshly, but kindness depended heavily on individual personalities rather than reliable protections. A compassionate overseer could make difficult work feel slightly more bearable. A cruel one could fill entire rooms with fear. Children learned quickly how to read moods, avoid punishment, and remain unnoticed when necessary. Observation became a survival skill. Meanwhile, in crowded neighborhoods across the city, mothers carried endless responsibilities from dawn until late into the night. Victorian women in poor households often worked both inside and outside the home. Some washed laundry for wealthier families. Others cleaned houses, sold food, stitched clothing, or took in sewing work late into the evenings. After returning home, more labor still waited. Meals to prepare. Children to wash. Floors to sweep. Clothing to mend beside candlelight. Their exhaustion rarely received much attention in official histories, yet they held entire households together through patience and constant effort. Children watched these routines closely. A daughter observing her mother carefully patching worn sleeves. A son carrying heavy water buckets because his father's back ached after work. Families survived through cooperation because survival demanded it. Even very small children often contributed somehow. Watching younger siblings. Gathering coal fallen from carts. Running errands through the streets. No one remained entirely separate from labor for long. Yet childhood itself still existed within these difficult lives. Children remained curious about the world around them. They chased stray cats through alleyways. Watched puppet shows in crowded markets. Pressed faces against bakery windows smelling fresh bread inside. Listened wide-eyed to stories told beside fires during winter evenings. Wonder survived in small quiet ways. The Victorian world contained many sights capable of stirring a child's imagination. Huge steam engines roaring through railway stations. Ships arriving from distant countries loaded with unfamiliar goods. Circuses traveling through towns with painted wagons and lanterns glowing after dark. Even simple shop windows filled with toys or sweets could seem magical to children who owned very little themselves. Christmas especially carried an atmosphere of gentle wonder despite hardship. Snow sometimes fell softly across the city rooftops while church bells echoed through the cold evening air. Candles glowed warmly in windows. Evergreen branches decorated small rooms where families gathered closely together against the winter darkness. For poor children, gifts were often modest. A knitted scarf. A small orange. A wooden toy carved by hand. But anticipation itself brought joy. Even factory workers and exhausted parents tried to create moments of warmth during the holiday season. Songs drifted quietly through narrow streets. Soup simmered beside fires. Children fell asleep listening to distant bells beneath blankets patched from many winters. As the 19th century moved forward, some reforms slowly improved conditions for children. Certain laws reduced working hours. More schools opened for poor families. Public discussions about health, sanitation, and labor became increasingly common. Yet change rarely arrived quickly enough for those already enduring difficult childhoods. For many boys and girls, life remained shaped by hard work, crowded living conditions, illness, and uncertainty. Still, they continued growing older beneath the smoky skies of the Victorian world. A small girl working beside spinning machines eventually became a young woman with children of her own. A coal boy became a miner like his father before him. A servant child learned every hidden rhythm of great houses and silent hallways. Generations followed one another through the same streets and routines. And through it all, the city itself continued breathing endlessly around them. Morning smoke rising into gray skies. Rainwater shining beneath gas lamps. The river moving quietly through fog. Horse carts rattling over stones worn smooth by countless footsteps. Late at night, after another long day had faded into darkness, tired children rested once more inside crowded homes scattered across the city. Some slept deeply beside dying fires. Others listened sleepily to parents speaking softly nearby. Outside, rain began falling again, gentle and steady against the rooftops. The sound drifted through the narrow streets like a quiet lullaby over London. And slowly, beneath blankets warmed by shared body heat and the closeness of family, Victorian children surrendered once more to sleep while the great industrial city settled softly around them in the cold night air. Rain continued through the night, falling softly over the city in long quiet threads. Water gathered along the edges of rooftops before dripping steadily into narrow alleyways below. The streets of London shimmered beneath gas lamps whose pale yellow light reflected gently across wet stones and muddy cart tracks. The river moved dark and silent beside the sleeping docks. Ships rocked slowly against their moorings while ropes creaked faintly in the damp wind. Somewhere far away, a bell rang through the fog, low and distant, then disappeared again into the rainy darkness. Inside the crowded homes of working families, the sound of rain often brought a strange feeling of comfort. It softened the harsh noises of the city. Factory whistles were silent now. Markets had emptied. Even the horses seemed quieter beneath the storm. Children sleeping beside small fires listened unconsciously to the steady tapping against windows and rooftops while exhaustion held them deeply in sleep. For a few peaceful hours, labor could not reach them. Yet morning always returned. And with it came the routines that shaped nearly every part of Victorian childhood. Before sunrise, the city slowly began waking beneath the rain clouds. Chimneys released fresh smoke into the cold gray air while workers stepped into the streets wrapped in scarves and heavy coats darkened by damp weather. Children hurried along beside them. Some carried lunch tins beneath their arms. Others tucked cold hands deep into worn pockets while splashing carefully around puddles. Their boots were often thin and poorly insulated against water. After long walks through rain-soaked streets, socks remained damp for the entire day. In factories and workshops, children sometimes worked for hours while clothing slowly dried against the warmth of machinery and crowded rooms. Winter rain felt especially difficult. Cold water slipped beneath collars and sleeves. Wind blew sharply through narrow streets lined with tall brick buildings. Fog mixed with smoke until the morning sky seemed almost colorless. Still, work continued. The industrial city did not pause for weather. Inside one textile mill near the eastern side of London, rows of children took their places beside spinning frames while rain streaked down the windows behind them. The room smelled of steam, machine oil, damp cloth, and wet wool drying slowly from coats hung near the entrance. The machines began their endless rhythm once again. Clattering. Turning. Shaking the floorboards beneath tired feet. Children moved carefully through narrow spaces carrying spools and repairing threads while supervisors walked slowly between the rows watching the pace of work. The hours stretched ahead quietly. Some children measured time by the position of light on the windows. Others listened for bells marking brief meal breaks. And some simply focused on one task at a time, allowing routine itself to carry them through the day. The body often adapted to exhaustion in strange ways. A child who once struggled to stand for long hours slowly became capable of working from darkness until dusk. Muscles strengthened from repetition. Hands toughened from labor. The mind learned how to drift slightly away from discomfort while continuing familiar motions automatically. Yet the cost remained. Children often appeared older than they truly were. Faces looked pale from factory air and long hours indoors. Shoulders slumped with fatigue. Coughs lingered through cold seasons and returned again with the damp weather. Still, many children rarely spoke openly about suffering. Hardship was woven deeply into ordinary life. People endured because everyone around them endured too. In poorer neighborhoods, entire streets shared similar struggles. Families borrowed coal from neighbors during difficult winters. Women exchanged small portions of food when one household had slightly more than another. Children grew up surrounded by this quiet network of survival. A neighbor watching younger children while a mother worked late. Someone sharing hot tea after illness. Men helping push broken carts through muddy roads during storms. Communities formed not because life was easy, but because difficulty required cooperation. The city itself could feel both crowded and lonely at the same time. Millions of people lived close together, yet many children still experienced long moments of isolation within their daily routines. A servant girl polishing silver alone in a silent dining room after midnight. A chimney sweep climbing dark rooftops before dawn while the streets below remained empty. A newspaper boy standing in cold rain beside a station hoping travelers might purchase one final paper before nightfall. Victorian childhood often demanded independence very early. Children learned how to navigate busy streets, difficult employers, crowded markets, and dangerous workplaces long before adulthood. And yet, beneath that independence remained ordinary childhood feelings. Fear during thunderstorms. Happiness at the smell of fresh bread. Excitement when snow began falling outside. Comfort in hearing familiar voices at home after a long day. Simple human emotions remained unchanged despite the hardship surrounding them. During rainy evenings, home became especially important. Wet boots lined up near the fire. Steam rose gently from drying clothing. Candles flickered against walls darkened slightly by smoke and age. Families gathered close together because the cold outside made closeness feel necessary. Some mothers mended clothing while children rested nearby on stools or blankets spread across the floor. Fathers removed heavy work boots slowly with tired hands while kettles warmed over weak fires. The atmosphere inside these rooms could feel surprisingly peaceful despite poverty. Rain tapping softly against windows. Soup simmering quietly. The warmth of shared space after a difficult day. Children often remembered such moments more deeply than the labor itself. Not because hardship disappeared, but because small comforts became especially meaningful within hard lives. In wealthier parts of the city, rain created a different atmosphere. Carriages rolled quietly through cleaner streets lined with tall houses glowing warmly behind curtains. Inside drawing rooms, fires burned brightly while children practiced piano lessons or read books beneath gaslight. Servants carried trays of tea through polished hallways while rain blurred the windows beyond. Yet even comfortable homes followed strict routines. Victorian society valued order greatly. Children studied at set hours. Meals occurred according to schedule. Manners shaped conversation, posture, and behavior constantly. Young boys preparing for elite schools often faced demanding expectations around discipline and achievement. Girls practiced embroidery, music, French, and social etiquette intended to prepare them for adulthood within polite society. Comfort existed there, but freedom still remained carefully controlled. Across every social class, childhood involved preparation for adult roles. The difference lay mostly in what kind of future children were being prepared to enter. For poor children, preparation often meant labor itself. By the age of 10 or 12, many already understood trades, household responsibilities, or survival skills that consumed nearly every hour of daily life. Some became astonishingly capable at very young ages. A girl managing younger siblings while her mother worked. A boy navigating the city streets alone to deliver goods across unfamiliar neighborhoods. Children developed resilience because circumstances demanded it from them. But resilience did not erase exhaustion. As evening approached again, factory workers poured slowly from large brick buildings into streets darkened by clouds and early sunset. Rain still fell lightly while gas lamps flickered awake along the roads one by one. Children walked home through the wet streets with tired, careful steps. Some carried wages folded safely inside pockets or cloth pouches. Those small coins mattered greatly to their families. Rent, food, coal, candles, soap, and medicine all depended on wages earned through long difficult hours. A child's income could help keep an entire household afloat during difficult seasons. And so labor carried enormous emotional weight as well as physical strain. Children knew their work mattered. They saw the relief in parents' faces when wages were enough to buy extra bread or fuel during winter. They noticed the tension when money fell short. These quiet observations shaped them deeply. At night, the rain finally began easing over the city. Fog drifted once more between the rooftops while chimney smoke curled slowly upward into the dark sky. The streets grew quieter as shops closed and workers disappeared indoors behind glowing windows. Inside one narrow home near the river, a young boy sat beside the fire mending a torn sleeve while his younger sister slept nearby beneath blankets. Their mother stirred a pot slowly over the coals while outside the final carts rattled softly through the wet streets. The room smelled of soup, damp clothing, smoke, and warm bread. Tiredness settled gently over everyone there. The boy's eyes grew heavy. The fire crackled softly. Rainwater dripped from the roof outside in slow, steady rhythms. Across the city, thousands of similar evenings unfolded quietly at the same time. Different families. Different hardships. Yet the same longing for warmth, safety, and rest after another difficult day. And little by little, candles dimmed behind windows across Victorian London. The factories stood silent once more beneath the drifting fog. The river carried dark water through the sleeping city. And children whose lives had been shaped by labor, endurance, and quiet resilience slowly closed their eyes beneath the rainy night, surrendering again to the deep heavy sleep of exhaustion while the storm faded gently into silence outside. The storm passed during the night, leaving the city wrapped in a cold and delicate stillness. By morning, the streets of London glistened beneath pale grey light. Rainwater rested in shallow pools beside curbs and beneath market carts while thin trails of mist drifted slowly upward from the river. Chimneys had already begun releasing smoke into the damp air, softening the skyline until rooftops and factory towers seemed to fade gently into the clouds above. The city looked tired before the day had even begun. And so did many of its children. In narrow rooms warmed only slightly by fading coals, boys and girls stirred awake beneath blankets still carrying the chill of the night. Some rubbed sore legs before sitting up. Others remained motionless for a few moments longer, listening to familiar morning sounds drifting through thin walls and cracked windows. Footsteps overhead. A kettle beginning to boil. Someone coughing nearby. The creaking of floorboards in the room below. Victorian homes often carried the sounds of many lives close together. Privacy was rare. Families shared space because they had little choice, and children grew up surrounded by the constant presence of others. Yet within that closeness there was also comfort. No one faced the long difficult days entirely alone. Morning routines unfolded quietly. A mother tied her daughter's scarf carefully beneath her chin before sending her out into the cold. A father buttoned his coat slowly with stiff hands still aching from yesterday's labor. Younger children slept a little longer while older brothers and sisters prepared for work in silence. Breakfast remained simple. Bread dipped into weak tea. Cold potatoes saved from the previous evening. Thin porridge steaming gently in worn bowls. The warmth mattered as much as the food itself. Outside, the street slowly filled with movement once more. Workers crossed bridges over the river beneath low drifting fog. Horses pulled carts through muddy roads where wheels splashed water against the stones. Shopkeepers swept rainwater away from doorways while market sellers arranged vegetables beneath damp cloth coverings. And moving among the adults were children already carrying the habits of labor within their tired young bodies. Some walked quickly because factory bells waited for no one. Others slowed beside bakery windows where warm light and the smell of fresh bread drifted softly into the cold morning air. Small moments of beauty still existed everywhere in the Victorian city if one looked carefully enough. Steam rising from rooftops at dawn. Pigeons gathering along church towers. The soft glow of lanterns reflected in rainwater before sunrise. Children noticed these things even while hurrying toward difficult days. In one crowded textile district, factory doors opened slowly as workers disappeared inside from the gray streets. Warm damp air rushed outward carrying the smell of cotton fibers, oil, smoke, and steam. The contrast between outdoors and indoors felt immediate. Cold air vanished behind them. Noise replaced silence. Machines waited like enormous restless creatures preparing to awaken again. Young workers removed coats and scarves before taking their places beside spinning frames and weaving machines. Some tied aprons around their waists with practiced hands. Others stretched stiff shoulders quietly before the labor began. Then the factory came alive. Wheels turned overhead. Belts snapped into motion. Iron frames trembled against the wooden floors. Soon conversation disappeared beneath the roar of machinery. For children working there, sound became something physical. It surrounded them completely hour after hour until silence itself felt unfamiliar whenever evening finally arrived. Many learned to communicate through gestures and expressions because speaking loudly enough to be heard required too much effort. A nod. A raised hand. A tired smile exchanged briefly across the rows of machines. Small silent languages formed within these crowded industrial spaces. And despite the exhaustion, friendships still grew. Two girls sharing a crust of bread during the midday break. A boy helping another untangle thread before a supervisor noticed the delay. Children comforting each other quietly after accidents or punishments. Hardship often created tenderness as much as cruelty. The human instinct to care for one another survived stubbornly even within difficult systems. Elsewhere in the city, child servants moved silently through large homes where wealthy families still slept beneath thick blankets and heavy curtains. Morning began early below stairs. Kitchen fires needed lighting. Ashes needed carrying. Water needed heating. Young servants climbed endless staircases balancing trays, coal buckets, or fresh linens while trying not to make noise. The great houses often felt cold during the early hours before fires warmed the rooms. Hallways stretched long and quiet beneath dim gaslight. Clocks ticked softly against wall-papered walls while servants hurried through hidden routines that kept the household comfortable. Children working in service learned how to become nearly invisible. They moved quietly, spoke carefully, watched constantly for signs of approval or disapproval from employers. Mistakes could bring sharp criticism or lost positions, and losing work meant uncertainty not only for the child but often for their entire family. Yet even within those strict environments, small moments of peace existed. A servant girl pausing briefly beside a window to watch snowfall drifting across the garden outside. kitchen workers laughing softly together after the household had gone to sleep. The warmth of bread fresh from the ovens downstairs before breakfast service began. Tiny moments became deeply precious because there were so few of them. Across the river, the docks awakened beneath heavy fog rolling over the water. Ships emerged slowly from the mist like dark floating shadows. Dock workers called to one another while unloading crates, barrels, sacks of grain, and timber brought from distant parts of the world. Children hurried along the muddy edges of the docks carrying messages, sorting ropes, or searching for scraps that might still hold value. The river smelled strong in the morning. Mud, salt, smoke, fish, wet wood soaked by years of tides. Gulls circled overhead crying into the cold air while water slapped gently against the stone embankments below. For families living near the docks, life often felt uncertain because work depended heavily on trade and weather. Some days brought busy ships and wages. Other days left men waiting along the river for work that never came. Children understood these uncertainties quietly. They watched parents counting coins near candlelight at night. They noticed when meals became smaller. They learned how fragile stability could be. In the countryside far beyond the city smoke, another kind of Victorian morning unfolded. Frost rested lightly across open fields while sunlight spread pale gold over hedges and farmhouses. The air smelled clean and sharp with earth, hay, and cold grass touched by dew. Children there woke early too. Farm life allowed little laziness because animals required care regardless of weather or exhaustion. Boots pressed into muddy ground while boys carried feed to barns and girls gathered eggs from cold wooden coops. Breath rose white in the chilly morning air while roosters called across distant fields. The work felt slower than factory labor, yet equally constant in its own way. Nature itself determined the rhythm. Rain delayed planting. Heat dried crops. Winter demanded preparation and patience. Children raised in the countryside often developed strong attachments to the land around them. They knew the sound of nearby streams during spring floods. The smell of fields before rain arrived. The appearance of stars above quiet farms untouched by city smoke. At night, darkness settled deeply there. No endless rows of gas lamps. No factory fires glowing through the fog. Only moonlight over fields and the soft sounds of wind moving through trees. Still, rural life carried hardship too. Medical help remained distant. Winters could feel isolating. Harvest failures threatened entire communities with hunger and uncertainty. Victorian hardship existed almost everywhere, though it took different forms depending on where children lived. As the day passed slowly onward, the city settled into its familiar rhythms once more. Factory whistles echoed faintly across neighborhoods. Street sellers called softly to passing crowds. Church bells marked the passing hours above the endless movement of people below. Children worked. Waited, carried, cleaned, stitched, swept, lifted, walked. Always moving through routines repeated so often they became part of the body itself. And yet, beneath all that repetition, childhood still flickered quietly. A group of boys laughing while sliding across frozen puddles during winter. Girls whispering stories together beside factory windows during meal breaks. Children stopping briefly to watch puppet performers in crowded markets before hurrying home again. Small joys appeared unexpectedly and disappeared just as quickly. Perhaps that made them feel even more precious. By evening, fog began returning once again over the rooftops of London. Gas lamps awakened one by one along the streets while workers emerged slowly from factories into the cooling air. Their faces looked pale beneath layers of dust and exhaustion. Children walked home with aching feet through crowds moving silently beneath the fading sky. Some carried bread tucked beneath coats. Others carried only tiredness. But home still waited somewhere ahead. A warm fire if the family had enough coal. Soup simmering slowly. The sound of familiar voices in small crowded rooms. And after another long day shaped by labor and endurance, those simple comforts felt enough. Night settled softly over the city. The river darkened beneath drifting mist. Factory windows went black one after another. And Victorian children, whose lives demanded so much from them so early, slowly drifted once more toward sleep while smoke curled upward through the cold quiet air above the endless resting city. The cold deepened as winter settled more fully over the city. By late evening, frost had begun forming along the edges of windows and iron railings while fog drifted slowly through the narrow streets like pale smoke. The gas lamps glowed softly in the darkness, their yellow light blurred gently by mist and the faint snow beginning to fall from the silent sky above London. The city looked quieter beneath snow. Horse carts moved more slowly over frozen roads. Footsteps softened against the thin white layer gathering along rooftops and sidewalks. Even the river seemed calmer, dark water sliding silently beneath bridges coated with frost. Inside small homes crowded with working families, children gathered close beside fires that struggled against the cold. Winter always made life harder. Coal cost money. Warm clothing wore thin after years of use. Wet boots dried slowly near weak flames while icy drafts slipped beneath doors and through cracks in old walls. Many Victorian children learned to sleep in layers during the coldest months. Scarves remained wrapped around necks even indoors. Brothers and sisters shared blankets for warmth while breath drifted softly into the freezing air above their beds. Yet winter evenings also carried a certain quiet intimacy. Families stayed closer together. Cooking fires glowed longer. Candles flickered warmly against dark windows while snow fell silently outside. The contrast between cold streets and warm rooms, however small those rooms might be, created moments of comfort people remembered deeply. A mother stirring thick soup while children warmed numb hands near the fire. A father reading slowly from an old newspaper beneath candlelight. Soft conversation drifting through the room while wind rattled the windows outside. These simple scenes brought peace to lives otherwise shaped by exhaustion and uncertainty. But morning always arrived too soon. Before sunrise, children once again stepped into frozen streets beneath dark skies still heavy with snow clouds. Their boots crunched softly across icy stones while factory chimneys released fresh smoke into the cold morning air. The city smelled sharper in winter. Coal smoke mixed with frost and damp wool. Breath rose white before tired faces. Hands disappeared deep into pockets searching for warmth that never fully arrived. Children working outdoors suffered especially during these months. Newspaper sellers stood shivering beside busy corners while snow gathered on their caps and shoulders. Crossing sweepers waited beside muddy roads hoping travelers might toss them coins for clearing paths through slush and horse waste. Some children sold hot chestnuts beside small glowing fires whose warmth barely reached beyond the iron pans. Others wandered through crowds carrying trays of matches, ribbons, or flowers with red frozen hands hidden beneath thin gloves. The winter city could feel both beautiful and cruel at the same time. Snow softened the harshness of brick buildings and smoky streets. But cold entered deeply into tired bodies already weakened by poor food and long labor. Inside factories, warmth from machinery offered relief from the icy outdoors, yet it brought its own discomfort. Wet coats steamed slowly near the entrances. The air became thick and humid from heat trapped inside crowded rooms. Windows fogged over completely while outside snow continued falling across the city unseen by many workers for hours at a time. Children moved through the familiar routines almost automatically now. Tie the thread. Carry the spool. Sweep beneath the machines. Repeat. Repeat again. The body remembered even when the mind drifted elsewhere. Sometimes children imagined summer fields while standing beside hot machinery during freezing days. They remembered sunlight on rivers, warm evenings outside, or the feeling of grass beneath bare feet from earlier years in the countryside. Memory itself became a quiet refuge. And despite exhaustion, children still found ways to create small moments of play whenever possible. Snow brought rare opportunities for simple winter joy. Boys tossed handfuls of snow through alleyways while hurrying home after work. Girls traced shapes across frosted windows with cold fingertips. Some children slid carefully across frozen puddles before adults called them back to chores and responsibilities. These moments never lasted long. Labor always returned. Yet the desire for play survived stubbornly even within hard lives. In schools across the city, classrooms felt especially cold during winter mornings. Children sat wrapped in coats while weak fires crackled at the front of the room. Ink froze sometimes inside glass bottles during severe weather. Hands stiffened while students copied lessons across rough paper beneath gray daylight filtering through frosted windows. Teachers continued lessons despite the cold. Reading, arithmetic, writing, religious instruction. Discipline remained strict in many schools, but winter occasionally softened even stern classrooms slightly. A teacher allowing children to warm hands briefly near the stove. Hot broth served during especially harsh weather. Quiet sympathy shared when students arrived soaked from snow or freezing rain. Small gestures mattered greatly. For many poor children, school offered not only education but temporary shelter from the streets and factories. Though attendance remained difficult for families depending heavily on child wages, education slowly became more common during the later Victorian years. Books opened windows into larger worlds. Children read stories about oceans, explorers, distant mountains, and ancient cities while snow drifted quietly outside the classroom walls. For a short time, imagination traveled far beyond the smoke-covered streets surrounding them. Meanwhile, in the great houses of the wealthy, winter looked very different. Heavy curtains blocked drafts from tall windows. Fires burned steadily in several rooms at once. Thick carpets softened footsteps while servants carried coal constantly to maintain warmth throughout the household. Children there played beside Christmas trees glowing with candles during the holiday season. Toys filled nurseries. Cakes and roasted meats appeared at long dining tables surrounded by polished silver and warm light. Yet even privileged children experienced loneliness at times. Many upper-class boys spent long periods away at boarding schools where discipline could feel severe and emotional warmth scarce. Young girls often lived under close supervision, expected to behave with constant politeness and restraint. Victorian society demanded control from children across every class, though the forms of hardship differed greatly. As Christmas approached each year, however, a softer atmosphere spread through much of the country. Church bells echoed through snowy evenings. Shop windows displayed ribbons, candles, and small toys beneath glowing lamps. Families saved carefully for holiday meals even during difficult times. Children dreamed quietly about gifts they might receive. For poor families, celebrations remained modest. An orange. A scarf knitted by hand. A small carved toy. Extra bread and warm pudding shared beside the fire. But the emotional warmth of the season mattered deeply. For one evening at least, labor and worry loosened their hold slightly. Songs filled narrow streets. Candles glowed against dark windows. Snow fell softly across rooftops while tired families rested close together indoors. Children often remembered these nights long afterward. The warmth. The smells of cooking. The sound of laughter after weeks of exhaustion. Winter also brought greater danger from illness. Cold, crowded homes allowed coughs and fevers to spread rapidly through neighborhoods. Hospitals filled quickly during outbreaks while doctors traveled endlessly between homes carrying black bags through snowy streets. Many mothers stayed awake entire nights beside sick children during the cold months. They placed cool cloths against burning foreheads, whispered softly beside beds, listened anxiously to breathing while candle flames flickered in the darkness. Victorian medicine remained limited in many ways, and families understood how fragile life could be during winter illness. Yet communities often cared for one another quietly during hard seasons. Neighbors shared soup. Churches distributed coal or blankets when possible. Women visited sick households carrying bread or tea. Hardship created networks of quiet compassion beneath the surface of everyday life. As the long winter evenings continued, darkness arrived earlier each day. Factory workers left work beneath black skies long before supper time. Children walked home through snow-covered streets where gas lamps glowed softly through drifting fog. The city became strangely beautiful then. Smoke rising against moonlit clouds. Snow gathering silently on rooftops and bridges. The distant sound of church bells through frozen air. Even exhausted workers sometimes paused briefly to watch snow falling beneath the lamps before continuing homeward. Inside one small room near the docks, a young girl sat mending gloves beside the fire while her younger brother slept nearby beneath patched blankets. Outside, snow tapped softly against the window as ships creaked gently along the dark river beyond the fog. The girl's eyes grew heavy with tiredness. Her fingers slowed. The room glowed warmly from candlelight and fading coals. Across the city, countless other children settled slowly into sleep at the end of another winter day shaped by labor, endurance, cold mornings, and small precious comforts hidden quietly between the hardships. And above them all, the snow continued falling softly over Victorian London while the great city rested beneath the silent white night. The snow remained on the rooftops for several days. By morning, the streets of London were covered in a soft uneven layer of white marked by horse tracks, boot prints, and cartwheels cutting slowly through the slush. Smoke drifted upward from thousands of chimneys into the pale winter sky while church bells echoed gently through the cold air. The city felt quieter beneath snow. Sounds seemed softened somehow. Even the factory whistles carried less sharply across the frozen streets. Children stepped carefully along icy roads wrapped in scarves and coats patched from many winters. Their breath rose like pale clouds before them while their boots slipped against frozen stones hidden beneath the snow. Some children paused briefly beside bakery windows glowing warmly in the early darkness of morning. Fresh bread rested behind the glass while steam clouded the inside of the windows. The warmth looked almost magical from outside. Then the children continued walking. Factories still waited. Workshops still opened before sunrise. The long routines of labor did not disappear because winter had arrived. Inside the mills, workers stamped snow from their boots before entering the heavy warmth of the factory rooms. Wet clothing began steaming almost immediately near the heat of machinery and crowded bodies. The smell inside changed during winter. Damp wool. Wet leather. Coal smoke clinging to coats brought in from the freezing streets. Children rubbed numb hands together before beginning work while the machine slowly awakened around them once more. The rhythm of the factory never truly changed. Only the seasons outside shifted quietly beyond the windows. During especially cold mornings, children sometimes gathered close beside steam pipes or furnaces whenever supervisors were not watching too carefully. Even a few moments of warmth felt precious when the city outside seemed frozen solid. The younger workers suffered most from the cold. Small fingers stiffened easily. Thin shoes allowed icy water inside after walking through slush and snow. Some children developed coughs that lingered for weeks beneath the factory dust and damp winter air. Yet still they worked. The Victorian world expected endurance from children almost as naturally as breathing itself. Many adults believed hardship prepared young people for life ahead. Comfort, in their eyes, could weaken character. Discipline, patience, and labor were treated as virtues to be learned early. And so childhood often became closely tied to responsibility rather than protection. But even within those beliefs, tenderness still appeared quietly in everyday life. An older worker wrapping a scarf more tightly around a shivering child before work began. A mother warming stones beside the fire to place beneath blankets at night. A father carrying a sleeping child home through falling snow after a long evening church service. These small acts of care softened difficult lives in ways history books rarely describe. In the poorer districts of London, winter evenings arrived early. Darkness settled over the city long before supper while fog thickened between the buildings beneath the glow of gas lamps. Shop windows reflected softly across icy streets where crowds hurried home against the bitter wind. Inside tiny homes, candles flickered against damp walls while kettles steamed gently over weak fires. Coal had to be used carefully. Families often burned only enough to keep one room warm, leaving the rest of the house cold and shadowed. Children gathered close together near the heat while mothers prepared simple suppers from whatever food remained affordable that week. Potatoes, bread, turnips, thin soup. Sometimes a little meat when wages had been good. Meals were rarely luxurious, but warmth and fullness mattered more than taste during winter. After eating, many children still had chores waiting. Water needed carrying. Boots needed drying near the fire. Clothing needed mending before the next morning. A girl might rock a baby sibling gently while her mother washed dishes in cold water. A boy could sit repairing worn shoelaces beneath candlelight while snow drifted silently outside. The work of survival continued inside the home long after factory labor had ended. Yet evenings also held moments of peace. Families speaking softly together. The crackle of coals in the grate. The sound of wind against the windows while everyone rested safely indoors. For exhausted children, simply sitting still beside warmth could feel deeply comforting. In wealthier neighborhoods, winter brought social gatherings, decorated parlors, and brightly lit shops filled with holiday goods. Carriages rolled carefully through snowy streets while servants carried parcels and prepared large evening meals inside elegant homes. Upper-class children experienced winter through entirely different surroundings. They played games beside roaring fireplaces, learned songs on polished pianos, read books while snow gathered quietly beyond tall windows. Some went skating on frozen ponds or walked through gardens glittering with frost. Yet strict expectations remained there too. Children were still expected to behave properly, speak politely, and control emotions carefully according to Victorian ideals. The shape of hardship changed between classes, but pressure and discipline touched nearly every childhood in some form. Outside the city, winter transformed the countryside into something almost silent. Fields rested beneath frost while bare trees stood dark against pale skies. Smoke rose gently from distant farmhouses surrounded by snow-covered lands stretching quietly in every direction. Rural children woke before sunrise just as city children did. Animals still needed feeding despite freezing weather. Water buckets formed thin ice overnight. Hands became numb carrying firewood through the cold dawn air. But country life also allowed moments of stillness difficult to find in industrial streets. The sound of snow falling across open land. The creaking of barn doors in the wind. Lantern light glowing warmly through farmhouse windows after sunset. At night, the stars appeared brighter there away from city smoke. Children sometimes stood outside briefly before bed looking upward into the cold clear darkness while breath drifted softly around them. Then they hurried back indoors toward warmth and sleep. Victorian winters could feel very long. Cold settled deeply into stone buildings and narrow streets. Fog lingered for days at a time. Sunlight appeared only briefly through heavy clouds before fading once more into gray afternoons. Children often moved through these months with constant tiredness resting quietly inside them. Labor felt harder in winter. Morning darkness made waking more difficult. Cold air stiffened aching muscles. Illness spread more easily. And yet life continued through familiar routines that rarely paused. In schools, children practiced handwriting beside frosted windows while teachers paced slowly between rows of desks. In workshops, apprentices bent over sewing tables beneath weak lamplight during the early darkness of evening. At the docks, workers unloaded ships despite icy rain and bitter winds sweeping off the river. Everywhere, ordinary people carried on. And among them walked children learning slowly how much endurance life sometimes required. Still, winter also brought rare moments of beauty that seemed to quiet the city itself. One evening after fresh snowfall, a group of factory children left work to find the streets transformed beneath white drifts glowing softly under gas lamps. Smoke curled upward into the dark sky while church bells rang faintly somewhere across the river. For a few moments, the children forgot their exhaustion. One girl reached out to catch falling snowflakes in her glove. A boy laughed quietly after slipping on the ice. Another child stopped simply to watch the snow shining gently atop the silent rooftops. Then they continued homeward through the cold night. These brief moments mattered because they reminded children that life still contains softness even inside difficult days. As midnight approached, the city slowly settled into silence once more. The factories stood dark beneath the snow-covered sky. The docks quieted along the frozen river. Fog drifted softly between rows of sleeping houses while candlelight disappeared one window at a time. Inside a narrow room near the edge of the city, 3 children slept side by side beneath patched blankets while the last coals in the fire glowed faint red against the darkness. Outside, snow continued falling slowly over Victorian London. It covered the streets, the chimneys, the rooftops, and the silent factories alike beneath one quiet layer of white. And deep within the sleeping city, children whose lives had long been shaped by labor and endurance rested at last in the peaceful stillness of the winter night. The snow began to soften by early morning. Not all at once, but slowly, as if the city itself were exhaling after holding its breath through the long cold nights. Rooftops that had been white and still now showed patches of wet slate beneath melting frost. Streets turned heavy again, the snow becoming slush that clung to boots and carriage wheels. Fog returned as the warmth of a new day met the remaining cold. It drifted low between buildings, moving gently through narrow lanes where people were already beginning to walk, already beginning to work, already beginning to carry another day forward. The rhythm of Victorian life never truly paused. Even winter, even snow, even exhaustion did not stop it. Inside small rooms that held entire families, children woke again to familiar sounds. A kettle warming over coals that had been carefully saved through the night. A mother moving quietly so as not to wake younger siblings too early. A father already gone, leaving before sunrise, his place in the bed still warm for a moment before the cold returned. Children sat up slowly, pulling blankets away reluctantly, as if leaving them required a kind of effort beyond strength alone. The morning air inside the rooms was cold enough to make breath visible. So they dressed quickly. Layer upon layer. Clothing worn soft from repetition, patched at elbows and knees, carrying the memory of many winters before this one. Breakfast was simple again. Whatever remained. Bread carefully divided. Tea stretched thin with water. Sometimes nothing warm at all, only something small to quiet the stomach before the walk outside. And then the door opened. The city waited beyond it. Fog, damp stone, the smell of coal smoke and wet earth. Boots stepped carefully into slush, sinking slightly with each movement. The sound of the city returned in soft layers. Hooves, wheels, distant voices, the low echo of early factory bells beginning to ring across neighborhoods. Children moved through it all as if it were simply the way of the world. Because for them, it was. In the industrial districts, the factories rose again like heavy sleeping giants now awake. Smoke poured from chimneys in steady streams. Windows glowed faintly with gaslight inside even though it was still morning. Doors opened and closed continuously as workers entered in quiet groups, heads lowered against the cold. Inside, the air was warmer, but not comforting. It was thick with heat, steam, and dust from machines already beginning their endless motion. Children took their places without ceremony. They had learned the rhythm so well that even silence felt like part of it. Hands moved. Feet shifted. Bodies leaned into the work that would fill the hours ahead. Outside, the city continued changing slowly with the seasons. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip. Some mornings now carried a softer light, less harsh than the deep cold weeks before. The snow did not stay as long on rooftops. Patches of damp earth began to appear again along the edges of streets. But for working children, the difference was small. Cold still entered homes. Work still waited in factories and workshops. And exhaustion still followed each day like a familiar shadow. In the tailoring rooms, fabric replaced snow as the constant presence. Stacks of cloth in muted colors filled small spaces lit by weak lamps. Children sat close together, bending over seams, stitching carefully while trying not to strain already tired eyes. Needles moved in steady repetition. Thread passed through fabric again and again. The room stayed quiet except for the soft sounds of work. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows, as if reminding them of the wider world beyond the enclosed space. Sometimes, during short pauses, a child would look up. A brief moment. Just enough to notice the light shifting across the room. Just enough to feel the weight of hours still left in the day. Then the work continued. In the streets, life moved with similar steadiness. Street vendors adjusted their carts as weather changed. Newspapers were handed out with cold fingers. Chimney sweeps disappeared into narrow passages between buildings, their presence brief and often unnoticed unless someone looked closely. Children in these roles learned early how to blend into movement. How to pass through crowds. How to become part of the city's flow without interruption. Near the river, the Thames carried its own quiet rhythm. Melting snow and winter rain mixed into its dark surface. Barges moved slowly, heavy with goods, guided by men and boys who knew every shift of current and wind. The water reflected the sky in broken pieces. Gray above. Gray below. Between them, constant motion. Even there, children worked. Not always seen clearly from the busy streets above, but present in the smaller tasks along the docks, carrying, sorting, waiting for instructions that might change from hour to hour. The river shaped the city in ways both visible and hidden. It brought goods from distant places. It carried smoke, waste, and movement back out again. It connected lives that might never meet otherwise. And along its banks, Victorian childhood unfolded in quiet persistence. As afternoon settled in, the light softened further. Gas lamps flickered even though it was still day, their flames faint against the returning brightness of the sky. Fog thinned slightly, revealing more of the city's shaped bridges, towers, chimneys stretching upward in layers. Children walked homeward at different times depending on their work. Some finished early. Some stayed late. Many had no clear boundary between the two. A child might leave a factory only to carry out another task at home. Water, coal, errands, younger siblings needing care. Rest was something that came in pieces. Small moments scattered across the day. A few minutes sitting near a warm stove. A short pause leaning against a wall. A quiet breath while walking between places. Evening approached again without announcement. The city shifted tone as it always did. The urgency of labor softened into the slower movement of return. Crowds gathered on streets heading home. Smoke thickened again as fires were lit indoors. The smell of cooking drifted through open windows. Simple meals, familiar meals, meals that did not change much from day to day but still brought comfort after exhaustion. Inside one small home near a narrow alley, a boy sat by the fire while his mother folded clothing beside him. The room was dim, lit only by flame and a single lamp. Outside, footsteps passed occasionally through the wet street, fading quickly into distance. The boy's hands were still rough from work. Small cuts along fingers, marks of thread and wood and cold metal. He rested them near the warmth, watching the fire in silence. His sister slept already in the corner of the room, curled beneath a blanket that had been stitched many times over. The mother moved slowly, carefully, as if saving energy for everything still needed before sleep. This was the quiet side of Victorian life. Not the grand events. Not the public stories. But the ordinary evenings repeating across thousands of homes. Fires burning low. Clothes drying. Children sleeping. Adults thinking ahead to tomorrow's work. And outside, the city continued its slow transition into night. Gas lamps brightened along streets, forming long glowing lines through fog. The river darkened again, reflecting only faint light from distant bridges. Factories fell silent one by one. Their machines resting until morning, though their presence still lingered in the memory of those who worked inside them. As night deepened fully, the city softened once more. Sounds became distant. Movement slowed. Windows grew dark. And Victorian children, after another long day shaped by effort and endurance, settled into sleep that arrived not as comfort alone, but as necessary recovery from a life that asked so much from them so early, so steadily, and so quietly beneath the endless grey sky. The night in London deepened again, settling gently over rooftops and chimneys as if placing a heavy, quiet cloth across the entire city. In the distance, the river moved slowly through darkness, carrying reflections of faint light from bridges and lamps along its banks. The water did not rush. It simply continued, steady and patient, as it always had. Above it all, the smoke of the city drifted upward into a sky that was rarely fully visible anymore. Too much coal. Too many fires. Too many long days of industry stretching across generations. Inside the sleeping neighborhoods of London, the last sounds of the evening faded one by one. A door closing somewhere far down a narrow street. A final carriage rolling away over wet stones. Then only wind remained, moving softly between buildings. Children slept in small rooms that held the warmth of many bodies and the memory of many exhausting days. Some lay still beneath blankets that barely held back the cold. Others shifted slightly in sleep, faces relaxed for the first time since morning. The world outside no longer asked anything from them in these hours. For a little while, there was only rest. The city itself seemed to slow at night. Factories, which had filled the air with constant motion and sound during the day, now stood silent along the industrial districts. Their tall windows were dark. Their machines still. Their iron frames resting like enormous sleeping forms. Even the chimneys seemed calmer without constant fire. Only faint traces of heat remained, slowly disappearing into the cold air. Along the banks of the River Thames, fog gathered again. It moved low and unhurried, slipping between docks and moored ships. Ropes hung still against wooden posts. Empty barges rocked gently, held by currents that never truly stopped. The river carried the city's tiredness in its own quiet way. Not as burden, but as passage. Everything that moved through the city eventually touched it. Goods, work, weather, time itself. And yet, it remained steady beneath all of it. In the poorer streets, winter habits continued even in sleep. A child curled closer to a sibling for warmth. A mother pulled a thin blanket higher over a restless infant. A father, returning late, sat briefly near the fire before lying down without speaking, too tired for words. The fire itself burned low, reduced to glowing embers that gave just enough warmth to carry the household through the night. Outside, frost began forming again on window edges where warmth did not reach. But inside, the air held steady. Not warm exactly, but sheltered. Morning would return as it always did. It always did. And when it came, children would rise again into the same rhythm of streets, labor, and movement that shaped their lives so completely it felt inseparable from time itself. Some dreams lingered quietly through the night. A field remembered from countryside days. A moment of laughter shared during a rare pause in work. The sound of rain against a roof that felt distant and safe rather than cold and heavy. Dreams did not change their circumstances, but they softened them for a while. In wealthier districts of the city, night looked different but still held its own stillness. Large houses stood behind iron gates, their windows dark except for a few faint lamps left burning in upper rooms or hallways. Inside, servants moved quietly even at late hours, ensuring everything remained in order for the morning ahead. Children there slept in warmer rooms, sometimes alone, sometimes watched over by attendants. Their days were less filled with physical labor, but still shaped by structure and expectation. Lessons, manners, schedules, and preparation for futures already decided by family position. Sleep came there as well. Different in surroundings. Similar in silence. Across all parts of the city, night created a brief equality. Not in life, but in rest. The cold air outside grew sharper as hours passed. Frost spread further across rooftops and railings. Even the fog seemed to thin slightly, revealing faint outlines of chimneys and distant spires under the weak light of a hidden moon. Somewhere, a bell rang once through the night. Not urgent. Not loud. Just a single sound passing through the stillness before disappearing again into silence. Inside a small room near the edge of the industrial district, a child turned slightly in sleep, one hand resting near the edge of a blanket patched many times over. The fire had almost faded now. Only a soft glow remained, barely enough to outline the shape of the room. Outside, footsteps did not pass anymore. The streets were empty. Even the wind seemed to move more gently, as if unwilling to disturb what little rest the city had finally found. And so the night continued in its slow, steady way. Not ending. Not beginning. Just existing. Holding the city for a few more hours before morning would return again, as it always did, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of labor, movement, and endurance that shaped Victorian childhood across every street, every home, and every quiet waking moment beneath the pale returning sky. The last hours of night settled gently over the city, softer now, as if even the darkness had grown tired. In the narrow streets of London, fog no longer moved with the same weight. It thinned slowly, drifting upward in pale strands that dissolved into the cold air above rooftops and chimneys. The river below, the River Thames, flowed on with its steady rhythm, darker now beneath the fading night, carrying reflections that no longer held the shape of lamps or windows. Everything felt suspended in a quiet pause between darkness and morning. Inside small homes scattered across crowded neighborhoods, children slept more deeply now, as if their bodies finally understood that rest would not be interrupted for a while. The fire in many rooms had burned down to soft embers. No more crackling. Only a low glow against stone and brick. Blankets lay still. Breathing was slow and even. The long wait of the day, and of so many days before it, softened into sleep. For a moment, the Victorian world felt far away. Not gone. Just quiet. In factory districts, tall buildings stood without movement or sound. Machines that had filled entire days with noise now rested in silence. Iron frames, belts, and wheels waited motionless for the return of labor that would come with morning, as it always did. But not yet. Not now. Now there was only stillness. Even the streets seemed gentler under the thinning fog. Gas lamps burned low, their light dimming as if conserving itself for the next evening. A few final drops of water fell from rooftops after the earlier rain, each one landing softly into puddles that no longer rippled with passing footsteps. The city did not feel empty. It felt paused, as if holding its breath. In this quiet space, the lives of Victorian children rested without demand. No tasks. No bells. No instructions. Only the slow rise and fall of sleep beneath worn blankets and shared warmth. A girl near the river slept with her hands still resting on folded fabric she had worked on earlier that day. A boy in a crowded room lay curled beside his sibling, their breathing almost matching in rhythm. A young servant in a large house slept in a small corner room far from the warmth of upper floors, yet even there, the night offered its temporary softness. Across every part of the city, sleep arrived the same way. Quietly. Without distinction. Not as escape from life, but as a simple return to rest after lives filled with effort beyond their years. Outside, the first suggestion of dawn began to appear. Not bright. Not sudden. Just a faint change in the color of the sky above the rooftops. Darkness loosening its grip. Night giving way, slowly and without ceremony, to another day. And with that, the story settles too. Not with endings that feel sharp or final. But like the city itself at this hour. Soft. Still. Breathing gently between what was and what will come again. The world of Victorian children remains behind in its time, shaped by labor, endurance, and quiet resilience. And now, like the night itself, it rests. Just for a moment. Before everything begins again.